Hello, Phil Morris here, the Time and Time photographer, with a quick little note about the auto button in image manipulation programs. The auto button is not magic. I know this sounds like a no-brainer, but I find it rather surprising how many people new to photography use a powerful program like Lightroom or Photoshop, and all they do is click on the auto buttons and say, "That's it." I have several photos here from a recent session that we'll go through and see what auto does for us. Then we'll do one photo right. Now, I do like the auto button in these programs, but because in most cases it will get you to a neutral position, which is great to start from. But I found that any time that you are attempting to set a mood in your photography, auto doesn't know what that mood is and therefore can't guess. So let's start out in the develop module. And I have a photo here of a window that has a bunch of light coming in. We have a little bit of a brick here, and when we click auto we see almost no difference, and we click auto on the exposure settings and we see no difference. And that's because we have in this photo a nice balance between brights and darks, and the software doesn't know any better, and it thinks that it's a well-balanced photo, and in some cases it could be considered that, but I thought this would make a very good starting point. Let's go on to the next photo of the girl jumping off of the little ottoman there, and when we click auto, all of a sudden we get a much warmer coloring to her skin, which is very desirable, and that's because this was in a very shaded room. But when we click on auto for the exposure settings, everything starts to get darker. Now if you're going to print these photos, you don't want darker, you want brighter. So you want your brightness to be up higher, and in fact in this case we probably want our exposure to be up about there. The next photo. Alright, let's change the white balance to auto, and we get a little bit of more warmth in her face, but when we click on auto here, all of a sudden our model here gets very dark, and that's because this background, we've got a bunch of light coming in this window, and it wants to try to balance the lights and the darks, and all of a sudden she gets very dark. Now you may be tempted to bring up fill light, but that's going to wash her out. What you really want to do is get those settings turned off, and this is going to have to be something that you edit in Photoshop, where if you want to show some detail in the background and you want to show detail in her face, you'll want to blend those two together. You could also blend them as a high dynamic range image. Let's go on to the next one here. Now this is when we're having the nice sunset, and this is as shot, and when we go to auto, all of a sudden it washes out and gets rid of all that warmth from the sunset. And you know, one of the reasons why I was shooting this was because of that sunset. I like to have those yellows and oranges there. If we click on the auto for the exposure settings, since everything is fairly well balanced and she's well lit, there's going to be pretty much no difference here. Now in this photo, let's go ahead and we'll do auto on the white balance, and she gets a little bit darker. That's not necessarily all that great. But when we click on auto for the exposure settings, she gets really dark, and all of a sudden we lose all of that warmth that we had. So I'm going to back these back so that we get back to those nice yellows and oranges. Same thing holds true for this image. We click on auto, and all of a sudden it washes out our beautiful sunset. We click auto here and on our exposure, and we lose even more. The photo is nicely well balanced now, but we've lost all the mood. Now we're going to get into the extreme situations here. We've got the sun setting. I used a flash on this to give a little bit of a fill light, otherwise she would have been completely in silhouette. And if I click on auto here, all of a sudden she turns blue. And this is great if it's an underwater shot, but she is not underwater. If I click auto on this, it gives us a nice balance in the exposure settings, but then it starts to wash out the sunset. You still have the yellows and reds there, but it's not as powerful as it was back when I had that turned off. So this is another good candidate for some exposure blending or high dynamic range imagery. In our last image here, this was taken after the sunset, and if I turn on auto, it washes them out. They have a tendency to get a little blue because of the type of lighting that we had there. I like the yellow, the warmth of their skin here, and if I click auto here, they get really bright, which in this case may be good, but it looks like my flash really lit them up. So this is going to have some work done in Photoshop to balance this out, or some high dynamic range processing. So let's go over to this image right here, and I'm going to create a virtual copy and work on the virtual copy. And instead of doing the auto here, that doesn't give us anything that we want. And actually I can see bumping up the temperature a little bit here because I want it to be a little bit warmer. This is one of those sunsets where it was a gorgeous yellow light coming in, and if I click on auto, it makes it really dark, and I don't like that at all. So I'm going to go through the exposure settings here, and if I bump it up, you can see how much lights and darks I have available to me. I want this to be probably right around a plus 8.3. Now the recovery, in this case, there's no real whites that we need to bring back. We're not losing any detail anywhere. We can probably do a 1 or 2, and that might bring in some detail around the hair. That's about it. Obviously there's no reason for a fill light here. We've got everything we need from the sun. The blacks, in this case, if I run up the black, you can see that it really darkens out her hair. If I run it down, it looks a little washed out, so where it was by default around 4 or 5 looks good to me. Now for the clarity, as I've said in other postings, I have a set of settings that work great for my camera. I have tried other cameras, and these settings don't necessarily work. You have to play around and figure out which ones work best for you. The clarity is something that you need to look at 1:1 ratio to see how much it brings out in the face. The vibrance is the colors that you don't normally see saturated, and I like boosting those up a little bit above what you would normally do for saturation. Now on the tone curve, lately I've found that I like bumping up my highlights a little bit and bringing down my shadows just a little bit to give a little more contrast to the overall image. And generally I want this to be very well balanced. So if I do a +6, I'm doing a -6, and that is something that's very relative to the way I shoot. There is pretty much no reason to change any colors here. The only thing I can think of is this background has a little bit of blue in it, and since she has no blue in her, I might want to boost up the aquas and the blues a little bit to give a little more color balance to it. That's about it. Now normally I start out with camera calibration, but in this case I knew that portrait was going to make her way too red because of the sunset, and the neutral settings was going to really wash her out. The camera standard is still kind of very red, so I just stuck with my Adobe standard here, and that's how I did my development. Now that's pretty much it for the settings on this. In my next blog posting, we're going to take this a little bit further in Photoshop, and that's about it for this. Once again, my name is Phil Morris, and thank you for listening and watching.